Figure it out, my father Dante called out coldly as he handed my carry-on to the security officer, my stepmother Lisa nodding with a satisfied smirk. I stood there frozen in disbelief, my acceptance letter to Princeton clutched in my trembling hand as they turned and walked away from the international terminal. At 17 years old, with no passport, no plane ticket, and exactly $43 to my name, I watched my supposed family disappear into the crowd. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Leaving me stranded at O'Hare International Airport. My name is Millie Thornton, and until that moment, I thought I understood what family betrayal felt like. But watching my father and stepmother deliberately abandon me at one of the busiest airports in America, all because of an acceptance letter they never wanted me to receive, that was a whole new level of cruelty. The airport security officer, a woman named Officer Rivera with concerned eyes, witnessed the whole thing. "Did your parents just leave you here?" she asked, her voice reflecting the disbelief I felt. I couldn't even answer, my throat tight with shock as I watched the terminal doors close behind them. Through the glass windows, I could see my father and Lisa climbing into their Mercedes, laughing as they pulled away. The college acceptance letter in my hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Just 3 hours ago, I'd been excitedly packing for what I thought was a family weekend trip to visit my grandmother in Milwaukee. When we pulled into the airport instead, I was confused. When Dante handed me a small envelope containing those $43, I was puzzled. But it wasn't until I heard him say those words, "Figure it out," that I understood what was happening. They just left me here. I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. They just drove away. Officer Rivera gently led me toward a small security office, her hand steady on my shoulder. "Let's get you somewhere quiet," she said, her voice firm but kind. "This isn't right." The small office was brightly lit, with security monitors showing various parts of the terminal. Officer Rivera offered me a bottle of water while another security officer, an older man named Carl with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, reviewed the security footage. "We've got it all on camera," Carl said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They deliberately brought you here and abandoned you. That's not just wrong. It's illegal." I took a sip of water, trying to process what had happened. "It's because of this," I said, smoothing out the acceptance letter on the desk. "I got into Princeton on a full scholarship. They found out this morning." Officer Rivera looked confused. "They abandoned you because you got into an Ivy League school? On a scholarship?" I nodded, the reality of my situation starting to sink. Lisa has 2 sons from her previous marriage, Sonny and Will. They've both been applying to colleges, but neither of them. I trailed off, not wanting to sound boastful despite everything. "Neither of them got scholarships," Carl finished for me, understanding dawning on his face. "So they were jealous." "It's more than that," I explained, the words coming easier now. "My mom died when I was 12. She left a college fund for me, but Dante and Lisa have been using it for their expenses, for the boys' private school. There's nothing left. They told me community college was my only option. When Princeton offered me a full ride, they realized their financial plan was falling apart," Officer Rivera said, her expression hardening. "And their response was to abandon a minor at an airport, with no money, no ID, no way to get home." Carl was already on the phone, his voice low as he spoke to someone about child endangerment and abandonment of a minor. I should have felt embarrassed or tried to stop him, but instead, I felt a strange calm washing over me. For years, I'd been told I was overreacting to my treatment in that house, that I should be grateful for the roof over my head, that I was being dramatic when I pointed out the differences in how I was treated compared to my stepbrothers. Now there were witnesses. Now there was evidence. Now someone else was finally seeing what I'd been living with for 5 years. Officer Rivera sat down across from me. "Millie, we need to ask you some questions," and then we'll need to file a report. This is serious. Do you have any other family you can stay with? I thought about my grandmother in Milwaukee, who'd been kept away from me for the past 3 years after she questioned how Dante and Lisa were using my college fund. I thought about my mother's sister in Boston, who'd lost touch after Lisa, accidentally, deleted her messages and emails. I think so, I said, hope flickering for the first time. If we can reach them. As Carl continued his phone calls, now speaking with Child Protective Services, Officer Rivera pulled out a notepad. Let's start from the beginning, she said gently. When did things change with your father? When did you first notice something wasn't right? Looking at the acceptance letter that had triggered today's events, I realized that things hadn't changed suddenly. There had been warning signs from the beginning, small cruelties that had grown over time, boundaries that had slowly eroded, until abandoning me at an airport seemed like a reasonable solution to them. It started after my mom died, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. When Lisa moved in with her sons. As I spoke, airport security cameras continued recording, documenting the Mercedes that was now speeding back to the suburbs, carrying 2 adults who had no idea that their solution to the problem of my academic success was about to unravel their carefully constructed world. What they would find when they arrived home would change everything. Not just for me, but for them too. But I didn't know that yet. At that moment, sitting in the security office of O'Hare International Airport with only an acceptance letter and $43 to my name, all I knew was that I had been abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect me. And for the first time in 5 years, someone was finally doing something about it. Officer Rivera's radio crackled as she escorted me from the security office toward the airport police station. Other officers had been notified of the situation, and airport protocols for an abandoned minor were now in full effect. I clutched my backpack, the only possession I had with me, as we walked through the bustling terminal. We've got a safe room where you can wait while we contact Child Protective Services, Officer Rivera explained, her voice gentle but professional. Mr. Hayward at the service desk is also trying to reach your grandmother in Milwaukee. The airport police station was surprisingly quiet compared to the chaotic terminal outside. A female officer named Kate greeted us, her expression softening when Officer Rivera explained the situation. You must be hungry, Kate said, offering me a sandwich from the staff break room. It's just airport food, but it's better than nothing. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until that moment. It had been hours since breakfast, and the emotional shock had distracted me from my physical needs. As I ate, Kate set up a computer and turned it toward me. If you have any contact information for your relatives, we can try reaching them directly while CPS is being notified, she explained. I swallowed hard, thinking about my Aunt Margaret in Boston. My aunt, I haven't spoken to her in almost 2 years. Lisa, my stepmother, she said Aunt Margaret didn't want to talk to me anymore. But I never really believed that. Kate nodded encouragingly. Do you remember her phone number? Or maybe an email address? I closed my eyes, trying to recall the phone number I'd memorized as a child. My mother had always insisted I know important phone numbers by heart. I think so, I said, reciting the digits I hoped were still correct. While Kate made the call, Officer Rivera sat with me, explaining what would happen next. CPS will need to open a case. Since you're 17, there are different options than for younger children, but the priority is making sure you have a safe place to stay tonight. The reality of my situation was starting to sink in. I wasn't going home, not to the house where I'd lived for the past 5 years, not to the room that had gradually been emptied of my possessions to make space for Sonny's gaming equipment, not to the family dinner table where my academic achievements were dismissed while Will's mediocre baseball trophies were celebrated. What about my things? I asked suddenly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My clothes, my books, my mother's jewelry, everything is still at their house. Officer Rivera's expression was sympathetic but firm. We'll make sure you get your belongings, but that might take some time. The important thing now is your safety. A tall man in a suit entered the room, introducing himself as Detective Alan Schmidt from the Chicago Police Department's Family Crimes Division. Airport security called us in because of the nature of the situation, he explained, sitting down, across from me. I've reviewed the security footage, and I need to ask you some questions about your home life. For the next hour, I answered Detective Schmidt's gentle but thorough questions about life with Dante and Lisa, about how my bedroom door had been removed because teenagers need supervision, about how my part-time job earnings were contributed to household expenses, while Sonny and Will received allowances, about the college fund that had mysteriously disappeared, despite the clear terms in my mother's will. And this acceptance letter, Detective Schmidt said, carefully handling the Princeton document. When did you receive this? Yesterday, I replied. I'd applied in secret, using the school counselor's office for the application process. The letter came to my friend's house because I was afraid they'd hide it. When did you tell your father and stepmother about your acceptance? I stared at my hands. This morning at breakfast, I thought they'd be proud. Detective Schmidt's face remained professional, but I saw a flicker of something, anger perhaps, in his eyes. Instead, they told you to pack for a weekend trip, drove you to an international airport terminal, and abandoned you there with less than $50. It sounded even more cruel when laid out so plainly. I nodded, unable to speak. The door opened, and Kate returned, her expression brightening our somber conversation. I reached your Aunt Margaret, she announced. She's booking a flight to Chicago right now. Says she'll be here by tonight. The relief that flooded through me was so intense I had to grip the edge of the table. She's coming? She actually wants to come get me? Kate's smile was warm. She said, and I quote, I've been trying to reach Millie for 2 years. Tell her I'm coming, and I never stopped trying to find her. The pieces began falling into place. The lost birthday cards, the unanswered phone calls, the emails that never seemed to reach me. All this time, I'd believed I'd been forgotten by my mother's family, when in reality, Dante and Lisa had been systematically cutting me off from anyone who cared about me. We're also getting a warrant to secure your belongings, Detective Schmidt added. Based on what you've told us, we have concerns about potential financial exploitation of a minor. Your mother's will and the college fund need to be investigated. As they discussed legal procedures and temporary custody arrangements, I found myself staring out the window at the planes taking off and landing. 3 hours ago, I'd felt utterly abandoned, standing alone in an airport terminal with nowhere to go. Now, a team of people I'd never met before were working to help me, to protect me, to reconnect me with family I thought I'd lost. Officer Rivera placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Are you doing okay? This is a lot to process. I'm okay, I said, surprising myself with how true it felt. I just keep thinking about what they must be doing right now. They probably think I'm still stranded at the airport, or that I've been arrested for trespassing or something. They're in for quite a surprise, Detective Schmidt said, checking his watch. Officers should be arriving at their residence about now to execute the warrant and question them about the abandonment of a minor. I pictured Dante and Lisa returning home, confident that they'd solved the problem of my academic success, unaware that their actions had set in motion a chain of events that would expose years of mistreatment. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of justice awakening. What happens next? I asked, my voice stronger than it had been all day. Next, said Detective Schmidt, we make sure you're safe. Then we start finding answers. The airport police station's small conference room had become my temporary sanctuary as the afternoon stretched into evening. Detective Schmidt returned. with coffee and a notepad, settling across from me with a purposeful expression. "Millie, I need to understand how things got to this point," he said gently. "When did your relationship with your father begin to change?" I wrapped my hands around the warm paper cup, finding comfort in its heat as memories surfaced, not just of today's betrayal, but of the slow erosion of what had once been a loving family. "My mom died of ovarian cancer when I was 12, I began. Before she got sick, we were normal, I guess. Dad coached my soccer team. We had Sunday pancake breakfasts. He came to every school event." Detective Schmidt nodded encouragingly. "And after your mother passed?" "Dad fell apart at first. For months, he barely functioned. I learned to do laundry, cook basic meals, keep things going. Then, about 8 months after Mom died, he met Lisa at a grief support group." I paused, remembering how hopeful I'd been when Dante first mentioned Lisa. How I'd prayed for someone to help heal our broken home. To make my father smile again. Lisa seemed nice at first. She brought homemade meals, helped around the house. She had 2 sons. Sonny was my age, and Will was a year younger. Dad seemed happier, and I was grateful for that. The timeline of events flowed easier now, the pattern clearer from a distance than it had been while living through it. They got married quickly, just over a year after Mom died. That's when things started changing. The first big change was my bedroom. It had always been the largest kid's room in the house, but Lisa insisted Sonny needed it since he was the oldest boy. Dad agreed without even discussing it with me. Detective Schmidt made notes as I continued, describing how my possessions were gradually relegated to smaller and smaller spaces in what had once been my home. The boys got new gaming systems, designer clothes, sports equipment. When I asked for new shoes for cross-country, Lisa suggested I could use my babysitting money since your mom's medical bills left us stretched thin. "Did your mother have life insurance?" Detective Schmidt asked. I nodded. "And a specific college fund she'd started when I was born. It was in all the papers after she died. Dad showed me the statements a few times that first year. Almost $120,000 just for college, plus the insurance money." "When did you stop seeing those statements?" The question hit a nerve I hadn't even realized was exposed. After Lisa moved in, Dad said they were handling the finances together now, and I didn't need to worry about adult matters. I described how Lisa had gradually taken control of every aspect of household management, including access to my mother's family. The summer after they married, I was supposed to spend 2 weeks with my grandmother in Milwaukee, like I did every year. But Lisa said Grandma had called to cancel because she wasn't feeling well. When school started, I tried calling Grandma, but Lisa said her number had changed. "Did you believe that?" Detective Schmidt asked. "Not really. But Dad backed her up, and I was 13. I didn't know how to challenge them. I stared into my coffee, watching ripples form as my hands trembled slightly. The same thing happened with my Aunt Margaret. Calls that never got returned, emails that supposedly never arrived." Officer Kate, who had been quietly working at a computer in the corner, looked up. "Your aunt mentioned something similar when I spoke with her. She said she sent birthday cards, Christmas gifts, even tried to visit once but was told you were away at camp. The confirmation of what I'd always suspected, that I'd been deliberately isolated, sent a wave of anger through me so intense it was almost dizzying. The real trouble started when I hit high school," I continued, forcing myself to stay focused. "I was getting straight A's, joining academic clubs, winning awards. But at home, all the attention went to the boys' activities. Will's C+ in algebra got celebrated with ice cream because he tried his best, while my place in the National Honor Society wasn't even acknowledged." Detective Schmidt leaned forward. "Did they actively discourage your academic success?" "Not explicitly at first. But there were always barriers. The car was never available for my debate tournaments. There was never money for academic summer programs, though somehow there was always enough for Sonny's basketball camp or Will's baseball. equipment. I described the increasingly obvious disparity in how we were treated. How Sonny and Will received new phones and laptops for educational purposes, while I used the family's old desktop computer with strict time limits. Last year, I won a state essay competition with a scholarship prize. When I got home with the news, Lisa said, "That's nice, but could you keep it down? Will has a big game tomorrow and needs to focus." Officer Rivera, who had returned and was listening quietly, shook her head in disbelief. "The financial control got worse too," I added. "When I turned 16 and got a job at the local bookstore, Lisa instituted a family contribution policy. I had to give them 80% of my paycheck for room and board. Sonny and Will didn't have jobs, but they got allowances." "Did you ever ask about your college fund?" Detective Schmidt questioned. I nodded. "Last year, when I started looking at colleges, Dad got defensive, said there had been unexpected expenses, and the fund was temporarily depleted. He promised they'd figure something out, but the message was clear. Community college was my only option." "Which is why you applied for scholarships in secret," Detective Schmidt concluded. "Yes. My school counselor, Mrs. Winters, helped me. She let me use her office computer for applications, wrote recommendations, even helped me apply for fee waivers, since I had no money." I smiled faintly, remembering her kindness. She believed in me when no one at home did. The door opened, and a woman in a CPS blazer entered, introducing herself as Ms. Donovan. She spoke briefly with Detective Schmidt, before turning to me. "Your aunt's flight lands in about 2 hours," she explained. "In the meantime, we need to discuss temporary arrangements and get your statement formalized." As they discussed logistics, my phone, which Officer Rivera had returned to me, buzzed with an incoming call. The screen displayed "Home" with a photo of our house. Everyone in the room fell silent as I stared at the vibrating device. "You don't have to answer," Ms. Donovan said gently. But I knew I did. I needed to hear what they would say, how they would justify what they'd done. With a deep breath, I accepted the call and put it on speaker. "Millie?" Lisa's voice was sugary sweet, with an undercurrent of tension I recognized all too well. "Sweetheart, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. The police are here asking all sorts of ridiculous questions. You need to tell them this was all just a silly mix-up." I looked around at the circle of concerned adults who had done more to protect me in the past few hours than my father and stepmother had done in years. "It wasn't a mix-up, Lisa," I said, my voice remarkably steady. "You and Dad abandoned me at an airport with no way to get home. You did it on purpose, and there's video evidence." The silence on the other end was deafening. The silence from Lisa's. End of the call stretched for several seconds before she responded, her voice shifting from saccharine sweetness to cold calculation. "Don't be so dramatic, Millie," she said, the speakerphone amplifying her dismissive tone. "We gave you money. We taught you a valuable lesson about independence, which clearly you needed before going off to college. Now you're causing problems. For this family, as usual?" Detective Schmidt leaned forward. "Mrs. Thornton, this is Detective Schmidt with the Chicago Police Department. I should inform you that this call is being recorded and may be used as evidence in the ongoing investigation." There was a sharp intake of breath before Lisa's voice returned, now artificially composed. "Investigation? This is a family matter, Detective. My stepdaughter has always had a flair for exaggeration. We simply abandoned a minor at an international airport with insufficient funds and no identification," Detective Schmidt finished for her. "The security footage is quite clear. Is Mr. Thornton available?" "He's speaking with another officer," Lisa replied tersely. "This is all a misunderstanding that's being blown completely out of proportion." I watched the detective's face remain professionally neutral, even as his eyes hardened. "Mrs. Thornton, officers have a warrant to search your home for Millie's belongings, including her passport, birth certificate, and any financial documents pertaining to her mother's estate and college fund," I suggest you cooperate fully. The mention of my mother's estate provoked an immediate reaction. That has nothing to do with today's misunderstanding, Lisa snapped, her composure cracking. Those are private family financial matters. Actually, Ms. Donovan from CPS interjected. The potential misuse of a minor's trust fund falls directly under our investigative purview, especially in cases of suspected neglect or exploitation. I could almost picture Lisa's face, the tight smile she always wore when things weren't going according to her plan. My stomach twisted with anxiety, but alongside it was something new, a sense of vindication. I need to speak with my stepdaughter. Alone, Lisa demanded. Detective Schmidt looked at me questioningly. I shook my head. That won't be possible, he informed her. Millie is now under temporary protective custody. Any communication will need to be supervised until further notice. You can't do that. Lisa's voice rose sharply. She's our daughter. Dante, they're saying Millie is in protective custody. This is ridiculous. I heard my father's voice in the background, muffled but clearly agitated. Then the sound of the phone changing hands. Millie? My father's voice was a mixture of anger and feigned concern. What have you done? Where are you? You need to come home right now and explain to these officers that this was all a misunderstanding. The familiar pattern of blame and manipulation that had defined our relationship for years was suddenly transparent, laid bare for everyone in the room to witness. For the first time, I wasn't facing it alone. You left me at the airport, Dad, I said quietly. You said, figure it out, and drove away. Why would I come back to that? We were teaching you a lesson, he exploded, the pretense of concern evaporating. You think you're so smart with your fancy scholarship, thinking you're better than this family? We needed to show you what the real world is like. Ms. Donovan made a note on her clipboard, her expression grim. Detective Schmidt held up a hand, signaling me that I didn't need to continue this conversation if I didn't want to. But something had changed inside me. The fear that had kept me silent for years was giving way to clarity. The real world has been kinder to me today than you have been in years, I replied. Strangers helped me when my own family abandoned me. They're making sure I'm safe, making sure I get my belongings back, including Mom's jewelry that Lisa keeps borrowing. Those things aren't, Lisa began in the background. And they're looking into Mom's college fund, I continued, strength building in my voice. The one that somehow disappeared after you married Lisa. My father's tone turned threatening. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're creating problems that will follow you for years. No one wants a troublemaker, Millie. Not colleges, not employers. Is that Princeton scholarship worth destroying this family? Detective Schmidt had heard enough. He reached for the phone. Mr. Thornton, this conversation is over. I strongly advise you to secure legal representation before making any further statements. As he ended the call, the room fell silent. The open hostility and manipulations from my father and Lisa hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Officer. Kate broke the silence, her expression a mixture of shock and anger. They're not even trying to hide it, are they? They're still trying to control and intimidate you, even with law enforcement listening. Ms. Donovan nodded grimly. Unfortunately, this is textbook emotional abuse and manipulation. The good news is we have it documented now. My phone immediately began buzzing with text messages. Millie, you're making a terrible mistake. Come home now. Your father is heartbroken by your ingratitude. The police are threatening us because of your lies. This will ruin Sonny's college applications. Is that what you want? Detective Schmidt glanced at the incoming messages. I think we should turn this off for now, he suggested, showing me how to silence notifications. We have everything we need for the investigation. As the phone went dark, a wave of exhaustion hit me. The adrenaline that had carried me through the day was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. Ms. Donovan seemed to notice. Your aunt's flight lands in about an hour. While we wait, maybe you'd like to rest. There's a quiet break room where you can lie down." I nodded gratefully, but as Officer Rivera led me to the small room with its worn couch, my mind was racing. What would happen next? Would my father and Lisa face consequences? Or would they somehow twist this situation like they had twisted everything else in our family life? "Try not to worry," Officer Rivera said softly, as if reading my thoughts. "The system doesn't always work perfectly, but in cases with this much evidence, it usually works. You're not alone in this anymore." As I lay down on the couch, I found myself thinking about what might be happening at home. The officers with their search warrant, the questions being asked, the evidence being gathered. For years, I'd lived in a household where appearance mattered more than reality, where my father and Lisa maintained a perfect facade for the outside world, while a very different truth existed behind closed doors. Now those doors had been thrown open, and the truth was spilling out for everyone to see. My phone, though silenced, lit up with another incoming call, this time from Will, my younger stepbrother. I hesitated, then showed Officer Rivera. "It's up to you," she said. "You don't have to talk to anyone you don't want to." After a moment's consideration, I accepted the call. "Millie?" Will's voice was hushed, nervous. "Everything's crazy here. There are police everywhere. They're taking your stuff, and Dad and Mom are freaking out. What's going on?" In that moment, I realized that Will, too, had been a victim of Lisa and Dante's toxic household, even if in a different way than me. "They left me at the airport, Will," I said simply. "I'm safe now, but I'm not coming back." There was a long pause. "I know," he finally said, his voice small. "I saw them planning it this morning. I should have warned you. I'm sorry. I saw them planning it." Will's confession hung in the air between us. My younger stepbrother, who had mostly been a passive participant in the household dynamics, had known what was coming and had remained silent. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Officer Rivera had stepped just outside the door to give me privacy while still being nearby. Will's voice cracked. "I was scared. Mom was so angry about your scholarship. She and Dad were arguing all night after you went to bed. I heard her say you were ruining everything and that you needed to be taught a lesson." I closed my eyes, picturing the familiar scene, Lisa's controlled fury, my father's weak acquiescence. "What are they saying now about what happened?" "They told the police you asked to be dropped off at the airport to meet friends," Will replied. "But then the police showed them the security video, and now they're saying it was just supposed to be a short lesson, that they were coming back. For you in an hour. The lie was so transparent it would have been laughable if it weren't so cruel. I'd been abandoned at an international terminal, not even the domestic one where I might have had some chance of finding my way home. "Are you okay?" I asked, realizing suddenly that Will was now alone with them in their fury. "I'm fine," he said quickly. "They're too busy with the police to worry about me. Sonny's just hiding in his room playing video games, pretending nothing's happening." "But Millie, they found something in the attic. The police, I mean. They were looking for your birth certificate and found a bunch of boxes with your name on them." My heart skipped a beat. "What kind of boxes?" "Old-looking ones, with letters and cards inside. I heard one of the officers say something about mail, tampering being a federal offense, and Mom started crying. The implications hit me like a physical blow. All those supposedly lost birthday cards, the unanswered letters, the missing invitations, they hadn't been lost at all. They'd been deliberately hidden away, part of the systematic effort to isolate me from anyone who cared. "There's something else," Will continued, his voice dropping even lower. "They found financial papers in Dad's office. The police took his computer and a bunch of files from the filing cabinet. I heard them say something about conversion of assets and breach of fiduciary duty. Legal terms I didn't fully understand, but their implications were clear enough. The missing college fund, the life insurance money, there would finally be answers about where it had all gone. Will, I said, suddenly concerned for my stepbrother. The police will probably want to talk to you too. I know. His voice was surprisingly resolute. I'm going to tell them the truth. About everything. How they treated you. How different it was for me and Sonny. He paused. I should have said something before. I'm sorry, Millie. The apology was unexpected. A small crack in the wall that had divided us as siblings. Before I could respond, I heard commotion in the background. I have to go, Will whispered urgently. They're coming upstairs, The call ended abruptly. I stared at the silent phone for a long moment before Officer Rivera poked her head back in. Everything okay? She asked. I nodded slowly. I think things are happening at the house. Will says the police found hidden boxes with mail addressed to me, and they're taking financial records. Officer Rivera's expression was one of professional satisfaction. Detective Schmidt is very thorough. If there's evidence of ongoing financial exploitation or mail tampering, he'll find it. She checked her watch. Your aunt's flight should be landing soon. Ms. Donovan is heading to meet her at arrivals now. Aunt Margaret, my mother's younger sister, who I hadn't seen in over 2 years. The knot of anxiety in my stomach tightened. What if she was angry? That I'd believed she'd abandoned me? What if she didn't want the responsibility of a nearly grown niece with so much baggage? Officer Kate appeared in the doorway, her expression brightening the room. We've got some good news, Millie. The officers at your house found your passport, birth certificate, and school records. They're bringing them here now. I sat up straighter. Really? That quickly? Apparently, your father became very cooperative once Detective Schmidt mentioned potential charges for identity theft and financial fraud, Kate replied with a hint of satisfaction. They also found some jewelry that matches the description of your mother's pieces. The small victories were beginning to accumulate, creating a foundation of hope where before there had been only resignation and despair. There's more, Kate continued, her eyes twinkling. Your school counselor, Mrs. Winters, has been calling every law enforcement agency in Chicago trying to find you. She's on her way here now. The mention of Mrs. Winters brought unexpected tears to my eyes. She had been my silent champion for 2 years, the one adult who saw my potential and helped me pursue it despite the obstacles at home. She was the one who helped me apply to colleges, I explained, wiping my eyes. She let me use her office computer since I couldn't do it at home. She's the reason I got the scholarship. Kate nodded. She made that very clear to our dispatcher. Said she wasn't leaving until she saw you safe with her own eyes. The revelation that there were people fighting for me, that I wasn't as alone, as Lisa and my father had tried to make me believe, was overwhelming. A new officer appeared at the door, holding a document in a protective sleeve. We just got the emergency temporary custody order approved by the judge, he announced. Ms. Donovan can transfer custody to the aunt as soon as she arrives, assuming. Everything checks out. The legal machinery was moving with surprising speed, creating a path forward that just hours ago would have seemed impossible. My phone lit up with a news notification. Local couple under investigation for abandonment. And financial fraud. My stomach dropped. This was becoming public. Kate noticed my expression. Local news moves fast, she said gently. But you don't have to speak to anyone if you don't want to. We can protect your privacy. But as the initial shock faded, I realized I didn't want privacy. Not about this. For years, my father and Lisa had carefully maintained their public image as devoted parents, while treating me as an unwanted burden behind closed doors. The contrast between appearance and reality had been a prison, one where I constantly doubted my own perceptions. It's okay, I said slowly. I don't need to hide what they did. Officer Rivera smiled approvingly. That's brave, Millie. Very brave. Commotion in the outer office drew our attention. Through the doorway, I glimpsed a petite woman with dark hair streaked with gray, hair so like my mother's that my heart seized with recognition. Margaret Chen for Millie Thornton, I heard her saying, her voice breathless with urgency. I'm her aunt. Her mother was my sister. Officer Rivera looked at me. Ready? I stood on shaky legs, smoothing down my rumpled clothes. As I stepped into the outer office, the woman turned toward me, and time seemed to stop. She looked so much like my mother, the same eyes, the same way of holding her head. For a moment, we simply stared at each other across the room, 5 years of enforced separation stretching between us. Millie, she whispered, her voice breaking. Oh my God. Look, at you. You're all grown up. And then she was rushing forward, and I was in her arms, and the wall I'd built to contain my emotions finally crumbled completely. Aunt Margaret's arms around me felt like coming home. A home I'd forgotten existed. She smelled faintly of jasmine, just like my mother had, and the familiar scent unlocked a flood of memories I'd suppressed for years. I've been trying to reach you, she said, her voice thick with emotion as she finally pulled back to look at me. So many calls, letters, emails. I even drove to your house last year, but they said you were away at a school event. I was home, all weekend, I said quietly. They told me no one had come looking for me. Margaret's face hardened momentarily before softening again as she cupped my cheek. Well, that ends now. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. Ms. Donovan approached with a clipboard of documents. Ms. Chen, we've secured temporary custody orders that will allow Millie to leave with you tonight, but there will be follow-up hearings to formalize the arrangement. As they discussed legal details, Mrs. Winters arrived, her usually neat gray bob disheveled as if she'd been running her hands through it with worry. When she saw me, her professional demeanor broke, and she enveloped me in a tight hug. Thanky. God, you're all right, she murmured. When you didn't show up for our meeting about dormitory applications, I knew something was wrong. I called your house, but your stepmother said you'd decided against Princeton after all. She pulled back, her eyes fierce. I knew that wasn't true. The realization that Lisa had already been working to sabotage my college acceptance, even before abandoning me, sent a chill through me. Mrs. Winters was quite adamant when she called us, Officer Kate explained with admiration. Said she'd been helping you apply to schools in secret because of concerns about your home situation. I should have done more sooner, Mrs. Winters said regretfully. I suspected things weren't right at home, but you were always so private, so determined to handle everything yourself. Before I could respond, Detective Schmidt entered, his expression serious but satisfied. We've completed the initial search at the Thornton residence, he announced. Millie, we've found evidence that goes well beyond today's abandonment incident. He gestured toward a conference table, where we all gathered as he spread out a folder of photographs and documents. These boxes were found concealed in the attic, he began, showing pictures of dusty cardboard boxes labeled Millie Mail in Lisa's neat handwriting. They contain approximately 200 pieces of mail addressed to you over the past 5 years, including cards, letters, and packages from your maternal relatives. Interfering with mail delivery is a federal offense. Aunt Margaret made a small, pained sound. I sent you something every month. Birthday gifts, Christmas presents, graduation cards. I thought you might be angry with me for some reason when you never responded. I never received any of it, I whispered, staring at the photo of the boxes. I thought you'd forgotten about me. There's more, Detective Schmidt continued. We found financial documents that strongly suggest misappropriation of funds from your mother's estate. Based on the records we've secured, it appears your father and stepmother systematically diverted money from your college trust to personal expenses. He showed me copies of bank statements and transfer records. Even with my limited financial knowledge, the pattern was clear. Large withdrawals coinciding with the purchase of Sonny's car, renovations to the master bathroom, Lisa's cosmetic, surgery that she'd claimed was medically necessary. We're working with financial crimes specialists to trace all the transactions, Detective Schmidt explained. but preliminary findings suggest they've spent approximately $97,000 from your college fund on unauthorized expenses over the past 5 years. The number was staggering. Nearly all of what my mother had saved for my education, gone. What happens now? I asked, my voice small against the weight of these revelations. Multiple criminal charges are being considered, Detective Schmidt replied. Child abandonment and endangerment, mail fraud, financial exploitation of a minor, breach of fiduciary duty. The district attorney will make final charging decisions, but based on the evidence we've gathered, this case will be pursued aggressively. A text message from Will illuminated my silenced phone. They're both being arrested. Police are taking them out in handcuffs. Sonny and I are going to stay with our dad tonight. The image of my father and Lisa being led away in handcuffs should have been satisfying, but instead I felt strangely hollow. They had stolen so much more than money. They had stolen years of connection with my mother's family, poisoned what should have been a time of growth and opportunity with their resentment and manipulation. There's something else you should know, Detective Schmidt added, his tone gentler. When confronted with the financial evidence, your father attempted to blame everything on your stepmother. He claimed he was unaware of the extent of the financial mismanagement. Of course he had. My father's pattern of avoiding responsibility, of taking the path of least resistance even at my expense, was painfully consistent. Was that true? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No, Detective Schmidt said firmly. His signatures are on the withdrawal documents. He was an active participant. Aunt Margaret's arm tightened around my shoulders. What matters now is moving forward, she said. The Princeton scholarship is still valid, yes? Mrs. Winters nodded emphatically. Absolutely. I've already spoken with the admissions office to explain the situation. They're very understanding and will work with us to make sure Millie's transition to campus is smooth, despite these circumstances. For the first time since this ordeal began, I allowed myself to think about the future, about Princeton, about the opportunity that had triggered today's events. It still seemed surreal that in a few months I would be starting a new chapter so different from what I had imagined was possible. What about my things? I asked practically. My clothes, my books. Officers have packed essential items, Detective Schmidt assured me. They'll be delivered to wherever you're staying tonight. The rest can be collected later, once we've completed our investigation of the residence. Aunt Margaret squeezed my hand. I have a hotel room booked for tonight. Tomorrow we can fly to Boston together, get you settled at my place until the fall semester starts. Boston? The realization that I would be leaving Chicago, the only home I'd ever known, hit me suddenly. Unless you'd prefer to stay here? Margaret added quickly. We could look into options. I just thought... No, Boston is good, I interrupted, pushing through the momentary panic. Chicago held few positive connections now. My school friends were already scattering to various colleges, and the house I'd grown up in was tainted by years of unhappiness. Mrs. Winters smiled encouragingly. Boston is actually closer to Princeton, and I'll stay in touch, help with any college paperwork or recommendations you might need. As the adults continued discussing logistics, my phone lit up with more messages, not just from Will now, but from classmates and friends who had seen the news reports. Word was spreading quickly through our community about what had happened. Is it true your parents abandoned you at the airport? OMG, just saw your dad and stepmom on the news being arrested. Are you okay? Where are you staying? The private family matter had become public knowledge, the carefully maintained facade of normalcy my father and Lisa had insisted upon now shattered completely. There would be no more pretending, no more silent suffering behind closed doors. Detective Schmidt noticed my expression as I looked at the messages. You don't have to respond to any of that right now, he said kindly. Your privacy is important, especially during this difficult transition. But as I looked around at the circle of support that had formed around me in just one day, Aunt Margaret, Mrs. Winters, the officers and social workers who had treated me with more respect and care than my own family had in years, I realized I didn't want to hide what had happened. "Actually," I said, finding my voice, "I think I'm ready to tell my story." The next morning dawned with an unexpected sense of clarity. I woke in the hotel room I was sharing with Aunt Margaret, momentarily disoriented before the events of the eye. Previous day came rushing back. My father and Lisa were in custody. I was safe with my aunt. The life I had known was over. But something new was beginning. Margaret was already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee and her laptop, typing rapidly. She looked up as I stirred. "Good morning," she said warmly. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," I admitted. Despite everything, the absence of the constant tension I'd lived with for years had allowed for a surprisingly restful sleep. Margaret gestured to her laptop. "I've been in touch with a family attorney back in Boston, Carl Donaldson. He handled your mother's estate initially and has agreed to help us untangle this mess." Her expression turned determined. "We're going to recover whatever we can of your mother's legacy." The mention of my mother brought a familiar ache, but also a newfound resolve. She had worked so hard to provide for my future, planning meticulously even as her illness progressed. Her efforts wouldn't be in vain. "There's also this," Margaret continued, showing me a news article on her screen. "The story has gone national." I leaned closer, reading the headline, "College-bound teen abandoned at airport by parents angry about scholarship." The article included airport security screenshots with my face blurred and quotes from law enforcement sources about the ongoing investigation into financial exploitation and mail tampering. "There have been requests for interviews," Margaret explained cautiously, "from local news, but also some national outlets. You absolutely don't have to speak with anyone if you don't want to." I considered this as I poured myself a cup of coffee from the hotel room's small pot. The idea of discussing such personal matters publicly was intimidating, but there was also something appealing about finally controlling my own narrative. "What would happen if I did talk to them?" I asked. Margaret considered this thoughtfully. "It could help others in similar situations recognize warning signs of financial abuse or exploitation. It might also complicate the legal proceedings." She paused. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you." A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. It was Ms. Donovan from CPS, accompanied by Detective Schmidt and a woman in a crisp pantsuit, who introduced herself as Julia Larson, an attorney specializing in trust and estate litigation. "The district attorney's office asked me to consult on your case," Julia explained as we settled around the small hotel table. "Based on the evidence gathered yesterday, we're pursuing a civil case to recover misappropriated funds in addition to the criminal charges." Detective Schmidt opened his notebook. "Mr. and Mrs. Thornton appeared for their bail hearing this morning. Bail was set at $75,000 each, with conditions including no contact with you and surrender of their passports." "Did they post bail?" I asked, uncertain how I felt about the answer either way. "Not yet," he replied. "They're claiming financial hardship, which is interesting given the lifestyle they've been maintaining with funds that appear to have been diverted from your trust." Julia spread several documents on the table. "We've obtained preliminary freezes on their bank accounts and assets while we trace the diverted funds. The good news is that we've already identified approximately $42,000 in recoverable assets, including recent purchases and investments made with what we believe were misappropriated funds." The methodical way she described the process was reassuring. These professionals knew exactly how to unravel the financial web my father and Lisa had woven. "What about Sonny and Will?" I asked, thinking of my stepbrothers. Whatever their parents had done, this upheaval wasn't their fault. "They're staying with Sonny's biological father," Ms. Donovan explained. "He's petitioned for emergency custody, which was granted this morning." I felt a small measure of relief. Though my relationship with my stepbrothers had been complicated by the toxic family dynamics, I didn't wish them harm. Will actually provided a statement to investigators last night, Detective Schmidt added, surprising me. He corroborated your account of the differential treatment in the household and confirmed overhearing discussions about using your college fund for family expenses. The knowledge that Will had spoken up, had chosen truth over family loyalty, was unexpectedly moving. There's another matter we need to discuss, Julia said, her expression serious. Princeton University has reached out through Mrs. Winters. They're aware of the situation and have expressed concern about your well-being, but also want to assure you that your scholarship remains secure. They've also offered special accommodations, Ms. Donovan added. Early move-in to dormitories if needed, access to counseling services, and flexibility with orientation schedules while legal matters are being resolved. The knowledge that Princeton, my dream school, was extending such support rather than withdrawing their offer in light of the public controversy was overwhelming. For so long, I'd been conditioned to expect the worst, to assume that opportunities would be snatched away. I didn't expect that, I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. Margaret squeezed my hand. You earned that scholarship, Millie. What's happening with your father and Lisa doesn't change that. As the meeting continued, a strategy began to take shape. Julia would lead the civil recovery efforts while the criminal case proceeded separately. Ms. Donovan would help navigate the custody transition to Margaret, which would be straightforward given my age and the circumstances. Detective Schmidt would continue gathering evidence, particularly related to the mail tampering, which had attracted the interest of federal investigators. There's one more thing, Margaret said when there was a pause in the discussion. Several of Jennifer's, my sister's, friends have reached out after seeing the news. They want to help. She opened her email to show me messages from people whose names stirred distant memories. My mother's college roommate, colleagues from her teaching days, friends from the neighborhood where I'd grown up. People who had been part of our lives, before illness and death and remarriage had altered everything. They've started a support fund, Margaret explained, showing me a newly created crowdfunding page titled Support for Millie's Fresh Start. The description briefly outlined my situation and explained that funds would help with immediate needs and uncovered college expenses. The page had already raised over $12,000 in less than a day. People remember your mother, Margaret said softly. They remember the kind, brilliant woman she was, and they want to help her daughter. I stared at the donor list, recognizing some names and not others. All people who had been kept from me, or from whom I'd been kept, during the years with Lisa and my father. This is what they tried to prevent, I realized aloud. This connection to Mom's world, to people who knew her, who knew me before. Detective Schmidt nodded solemnly. Isolation is a common tactic in controlling relationships. Breaking those external connections makes it easier to normalize mistreatment. As our meeting concluded, Julia handed me her business card. We're building a strong case, Millie. What happened to you wasn't just morally wrong. It was illegal, on multiple fronts. There will be accountability. Once they had departed, Margaret and I sat in contemplative silence. The hotel room felt like a liminal space, between the life I was leaving behind and whatever came next. What do you want to do today? Margaret asked gently. Our flight to Boston isn't until tomorrow. We could rest or... I thought about the interview requests, about Will's text message from earlier saying that news vans were parked outside our house, about the supportive messages flooding in from unexpected sources. I think, I said slowly, finding conviction. In my voice, I want to tell my story, on my terms. The hotel conference room that the news station had arranged felt both intimidating and empowering. Lights had been set up, a camera positioned, and the reporter, a woman named Rachel Sawyer with kind eyes and a reputation for sensitivity in difficult stories, sat across from Margaret and me, reviewing her notes. We'll keep this entirely on your terms, Millie, Rachel assured me. If there's anything you don't want to discuss, or if you need a break at any point, just let me know. This interview airs only when you approve the final edit. Detective Schmidt stood just off camera, there at my request to ensure nothing was said that might compromise the ongoing investigation. Mrs. Winters had also come, offering silent support from the sidelines. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret asked one final time, her hand protective on my shoulder. I nodded. For years, my voice had been silenced, my experiences minimized or denied. This was my chance to reclaim my narrative. "I'm ready." The camera light blinked on, and Rachel's professional demeanor softened into compassion as she began. "Millie Thornton, thank you for speaking with us during what must be an incredibly difficult time. Could you share, in your own words, what happened yesterday at O'Hare International Airport?" Taking a deep breath, I recounted the events. The pretense of a family trip, the moment of abandonment, the shocking words my father had spoken. I described the kindness of the airport personnel who had helped me, and the discovery of the deeper betrayals that had been happening for years. This wasn't just about one terrible decision made in anger, I explained, my voice growing stronger as I spoke. This was the culmination of years of systematic isolation and financial exploitation. Rachel nodded encouragingly. "The police investigation has uncovered evidence that your college fund was misappropriated and that mail from your maternal relatives was intercepted. How did you learn about this?" "I always suspected something wasn't right," I admitted. "But in that kind of situation, you start to doubt yourself. They were always so convincing when they said no one had called, that no letters had come, that there just wasn't enough money for the things I needed while there somehow was for my stepbrothers." As the interview continued, I shared details of life in a household where subtle disparities had become normal. The different rules, the different expectations, the different resources available to me versus Sonny and Will. "Your academic achievements are remarkable despite these circumstances," Rachel noted. "You earned a full scholarship to Princeton while keeping your application secret. What drove you to pursue that path in the face of such obstacles?" I thought about Mrs. Winters, sitting just off camera, who had provided the practical help I needed. About my mother, who had instilled in me a love of learning before her death. About the stubborn core of determination that had kept me going even when giving up would have been easier. "I knew education was my way out," I said simply. "My mother was a professor before she got sick. She always said knowledge was the one thing no one could take from you." I paused, the irony striking me. It was actually her Princeton sweatshirt that I found in the back of my closet that made me think of applying there. Something of hers they hadn't managed to get rid of. Rachel's expression reflected the emotional weight of this revelation. "And it was your acceptance to Princeton that triggered yesterday's events?" "The scholarship meant I didn't need their financial support. Support they'd been claiming for years they couldn't provide because of circumstances. It meant independence. They couldn't control me through money anymore." The most difficult questions came next, about my father's transformation from loving parent to accomplice in emotional abuse, about the early signs I'd missed, about the calculated way Lisa had isolated me from my mother's family. Looking back, there were so many red flags, I acknowledged. But when you're 12 and grieving your mother, when you desperately want your remaining parent to be happy, you overlook things. You make excuses. By the time I realized how bad things had become, I felt trapped. Rachel nodded solemnly. "Your father and stepmother were arrested last night on multiple charges. How do you feel about that?" It was the question I'd been dreading, but also the one I needed to answer honestly, for myself as much as for the audience. "I don't take any joy in their legal troubles," I said after a moment's reflection. "But I do believe in accountability. What they did, not just yesterday but for years, was wrong. They broke trust, they broke laws, and there should be consequences for that. If you could speak directly to your father right now, what would you say?" The question hit unexpectedly deep. What would I say to the man who had once been my hero, who had coached my soccer team and checked for monsters under my bed, who had then slowly transformed into someone who could abandon his daughter at an Airport and drive away laughing? I would ask him when it changed, I said, my voice quieter but steady. When did I stop being his daughter and start being an inconvenience? When did Lisa's approval become more important than my well-being? I would ask him if it was worth it, trading his relationship with me for whatever he thought he was gaining. The interview shifted then to the future, my plans for Princeton, the support I'd received from unexpected quarters, the relationship with my maternal aunt that was being rebuilt after years of forced separation. Despite everything, you seem remarkably resilient, Rachel observed. What would you say to other young people who might be in situations similar to yours, where home isn't the safe place it should be? I considered this carefully, aware of the responsibility in my answer. Trust. Your instincts, I finally said. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Document everything. Find one adult you can trust, a teacher, a counselor, a friend's parent, and tell them what's happening. And know that what's happening isn't your fault, and it doesn't define your future. As the interview concluded, Rachel asked one final question. What do you hope comes from sharing your story so publicly? The answer came with surprising clarity. I hope it helps other kids recognize when they're being isolated or manipulated. I hope it encourages people to check on the children in their lives more thoroughly when something seems off. And I hope it reminds everyone that sometimes the families that look perfect from the outside are hiding the biggest problems behind closed doors. When the camera light turned off, there was a moment of profound silence in the room. Then, Mrs. Winters stepped forward, embracing me with tears in her eyes. Detective Schmidt nodded approvingly, and Margaret squeezed my hand so hard it almost hurt. That, Rachel said with quiet admiration, was one of the most powerful interviews I've ever conducted. As we left the hotel, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Princeton's Dean of Student Affairs, confirming that housing could be arranged immediately if needed, and expressing the university's full support during this transition. And, below that, a text from Will. I saw your interview. You were brave. I'm sorry I wasn't. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt something close to peace. The secrets were exposed, the truth acknowledged. Whatever came next, the legal proceedings, the recovery of my mother's stolen legacy, the transition to a new life with Margaret, I would face it with my voice intact and my story finally heard. The Boston skyline glowed in early morning sunlight as I sat across from Carl Donaldson, my mother's estate attorney, in his downtown office. 1 week had passed since the airport abandonment, a week of dizzying changes and revelations. Margaret sat beside me, her calm presence a steady anchor as we navigated the evolving legal situation. The forensic accountants have completed their preliminary analysis, Carl explained, sliding a folder across his polished desk. It's quite comprehensive. I opened the folder to find a detailed timeline of financial transactions spanning the 5 years since my mother's death. Each withdrawal from my college fund was highlighted, along with notations about where the money had gone. Renovations to the master bathroom, Lisa's luxury SUV, Sonny's private tennis lessons, Caribbean vacations. I'd been told we couldn't afford for me to join. In total, Carl continued, his voice measured but indignant, they diverted approximately $113,000 from your college trust fund and another $46,000 from your mother's life insurance proceeds that were specifically designated for your support and education. The numbers were staggering, far higher than Detective Schmidt's initial estimate. Nearly $160,000 of my mother's careful planning gone. Can any of it be recovered? Margaret asked, the question I couldn't quite formulate myself. Carl nodded, his expression brightening slightly. Actually, yes. The court has approved our petition to seize assets purchased with the misappropriated funds. The SUV, some jewelry, investment accounts they opened in their names. These can be liquidated and the proceeds returned to Millie's trust. We're estimating about $65,000 in recoverable assets at present. It wasn't everything, but it was more than I'd expected. Enough to supplement my scholarship, to cover books and expenses that the Princeton funding didn't include. There's also the matter of the criminal charges, Carl continued. I've been in communication with the prosecutor's office in Chicago. They're taking this case very seriously. He turned his computer monitor so we could see the document displayed on the screen, a formal charging record listing multiple counts against both Dante and Lisa: child abandonment, financial exploitation of a minor, mail fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conversion of assets, and conspiracy. Dante's attorney has reached out about a potential plea agreement, Carl said, watching my reaction carefully. He's offering full financial restitution in exchange for reduced charges. Where would he get that kind of money? Margaret asked, skeptically. If they've spent what was in Millie's accounts. That's the interesting part, Carl replied. Apparently, your father has approached his parents, your grandparents, for help. They were unaware of the situation and are, let's say, extremely disturbed by what's come to light. My paternal grandparents had been distant figures in my life, living in Florida and visiting only occasionally. They had always seemed to accept Lisa without question, to believe whatever narrative my father and she presented about our blended family. They've seen your interview, Carl added gently. Your grandfather called the prosecutor directly, offering to make financial restitution on Dante's behalf, on the condition that he accept responsibility and undergo counseling. The revelation that my interview had reached them had perhaps shattered. The carefully constructed fiction they'd been fed about our family life was unexpectedly powerful. What would a plea agreement mean for the case? I asked, trying to understand the implications. Dante would still have a felony record, but might avoid jail time. Lisa, however, isn't included in this offer. The evidence suggests she was the primary architect of the financial scheme, particularly the mail interception. The separation of their fates seemed fitting somehow. My father's weakness had always been his willingness to follow Lisa's lead, to choose the path of least resistance, even at my expense. Now he would have to decide whether to stand with her or save himself. You don't have to decide anything today, Carl assured me. The prosecutor wants your input, but ultimately the state will determine how to proceed with the criminal charges. As we left the attorney's office, Margaret's phone chimed with a news alert. She glanced at it, then wordlessly handed it to me. The headline read, Prestigious Family Foundation Cuts Ties with Board Member Lisa Thornton Amid Exploitation Charges. The article detailed how the children's charity where Lisa had served as a board member, a position she had frequently used to boost her social standing, had voted unanimously to remove her following the public revelation of her treatment of her stepdaughter. The foundation's mission to support vulnerable children is fundamentally incompatible with the alleged actions of Mrs. Thornton, the statement read. We are shocked and dismayed by the reports and have terminated all association effective immediately. It was just the beginning. Over the next few days, more consequences unfolded in rapid succession. Lisa's real estate brokerage placed her on unpaid leave pending the outcome of the criminal case. The private school where Sonny and Will had attended announced it was conducting an internal review of any financial assistance the family had received under potentially fraudulent pretenses. Most surprisingly, my Princeton story had sparked a broader conversation. Local news outlets were investigating other cases of financial exploitation of minors. A state senator in Illinois announced plans to introduce legislation strengthening protections for children's inheritances and trusts, specifically citing my case as inspiration. My phone had become a window into the ripple effect spreading outward from what had once been a private family matter. Former classmates sent messages of support. Teachers reached out with kind words and offers of help. Even a few parents of my friends contacted me to apologize for not recognizing what had been happening under their noses. The most significant message came from Will's biological father, a man I'd met only a handful of times over the years. Millie, I want you to know that Will and Sunny are safe with me. They're struggling with everything that's happened, but they're getting support. Will especially wants you to know that he's given a full statement to the investigators about how differently you were treated in the household. He's showing real courage, and I think seeing your courage helped him find his own. If you're ever comfortable with it, he would like to maintain some contact with you. No pressure, just know the door is open. The notion that my stepbrothers were also victims of the toxic dynamic Lisa and my father had created, albeit in very different ways, was something I was still processing. Will's decision to tell the truth rather than protecting his mother showed a moral compass that gave me hope for his future. Margaret found me on the balcony of her Cambridge apartment that evening, staring out at the sunset reflecting off the Charles River. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, handing me a mug of tea. "I was just thinking about consequences," I said. "Not just the legal ones. The way everything hidden is suddenly visible." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Your mother always said that truth has its own gravity. It pulls everything toward it eventually." "I never expected so many people to care," I admitted. After years of being told I was overreacting, that I was being dramatic, that the problems were all in my head. "Gaslighting is a powerful tool," Margaret said, the unfamiliar term capturing exactly what I'd experienced. "It makes you doubt your own perceptions, your own worth. But they couldn't erase what your mother, instilled in you. That core of strength that helped you survive until the truth could come out." As darkness fell over Boston, I thought about what awaited me in the coming weeks. Finalizing the custody transfer, preparing for Princeton, participating in the ongoing legal proceedings against my father and Lisa. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, it was a path I was choosing for myself. And somewhere in Chicago, in separate holding cells awaiting their next court appearance, my father and Lisa were facing the consequences of their own choices. Their carefully constructed facade of respectability had crumbled, exposing the truth they had worked so hard to hide. The Princeton campus sprawled before me in late August sunshine, its historic buildings and leafy quads exactly as I'd imagined during those secret late-night research sessions on Mrs. Winter's computer. Margaret stood beside me, both of us momentarily speechless at the reality of what had once seemed an impossible dream. "It's even more beautiful than the pictures," she said finally, squeezing my hand. The early move-in the university had arranged meant the campus was still relatively quiet, with most freshmen not due to arrive for another week. This buffer had been just one of many accommodations offered to help ease my transition, accommodations I'd initially been reluctant to accept, until Margaret gently reminded me that accepting help wasn't weakness. "Ms. Thornton?" A woman approached us with a warm smile. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Franklin, Dean of Student Affairs. We spoke on the phone last week." As she guided us toward the freshman dormitories, Dr. Franklin chatted casually about orientation schedules and first-year seminars, treating me like any other incoming student rather than the subject of a nationally reported family trauma. Her normalcy was precisely what I needed. My assigned room was simple but comfortable, with large windows overlooking a courtyard. A welcome basket sat on the desk with a handwritten note from the residential life team. "Your roommate will arrive next week," Dr. Franklin explained. "She's been briefed about your situation. Not the details, just that you've had some family difficulties and are moving in early. We've found most Princeton students are remarkably understanding and discreet." As we unpacked the new belongings we'd acquired over the past month, Margaret and I had shopped for essentials in Boston, carefully rebuilding what had been left behind in Chicago. I felt a curious mixture of nervousness and peace. Everything about this space was new, untainted by the past. "The security team is aware of the no-contact order against your father and stepmother," Dr. Franklin added, addressing the concern I hadn't voiced. "All campus entrances are monitored, and your privacy will be protected." The legal proceedings were ongoing, with preliminary hearings scheduled for October. Both Dante and Lisa had been released on bail, with strict conditions including the no-contact order and surrender of their passports. My father had accepted his parents' offer to fund restitution, agreeing to a plea deal that included 5 years of probation, mandatory counseling, and full financial responsibility for what had been taken from my trust. Lisa, however, had rejected any plea offers, maintaining her innocence despite the mountain of evidence. Her trial was scheduled for January, with federal mail fraud charges added to the state-level counts of financial exploitation and child abandonment. I had chosen not to attend any of the hearings, providing written statements instead. Carl Donaldson represented my interests in court, updating me regularly but respecting my desire to focus on building my future rather than watching the dismantling of my past. After Dr. Franklin departed, Margaret helped me arrange my new room, hanging clothes, and setting up the laptop that had been a gift from her and several of my mother's old friends. "I have something for you," she said when we'd finished, pulling a small package from her bag. "I found it when I was going through some of Jennifer's things I'd stored after she died." Inside the carefully wrapped tissue paper lay a silver necklace, with a delicate pendant, a small book charm that opened to reveal tiny engraved words. "Knowledge is freedom." She wore this through graduate school, Margaret explained, her voice soft with memory. "I thought you should have it now, as you start your own academic journey." The connection to my mother, a tangible link to her values and aspirations for me, brought unexpected tears. Margaret fastened the necklace around my neck, its weight both unfamiliar and perfectly right. That evening, we had dinner with Dr. Patricia Winters, my high school counselor who had driven from Chicago for my move-in day, bringing with her a binder of recommendation letters and application materials she'd kept copies of, just in case. "I always knew you'd make it here," she said, raising her glass in a toast, "even when everything was stacked against you." Later, as Margaret prepared to return to her hotel before flying back to Boston the next day, we stood in my new room, the reality of our separation suddenly daunting. After a month of living together, rebuilding our relationship and planning for this transition, the prospect of being on my own again triggered a flutter of anxiety. "I'll call every day," Margaret promised, reading my expression. "And remember, Boston is just a few hours away. Any weekend, any holiday, my home is your home now." "I know," I said, meaning it despite my nerves. "I'm ready for this." As we hugged goodbye, I caught sight of my reflection in the window, the silver necklace gleaming at my throat, my shoulders straighter than they'd been in years, my expression determined rather than defeated. The rebuilding wasn't complete, but the foundation was solid. Whatever challenges Princeton might bring, they were challenges I had earned the right to face. The Princeton Library became my sanctuary during that first semester, its soaring ceilings and endless rows of books offering both intellectual stimulation and emotional peace. 3 months into freshman year, I had settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible back in Chicago, attending challenging classes, participating in study groups, slowly building new friendships with people who knew me only as Millie, the pre-law student from Boston, not as the girl from the airport abandonment story. I was deep into research for a political science paper when my phone buzzed with a news alert. Normally, I would have ignored it, but the headline caught my attention immediately. "Lisa Thornton pleads guilty in financial exploitation case." My hands trembled slightly as I opened the article. According to the report, Lisa had accepted a last-minute plea agreement rather than face trial, admitting to mail fraud, financial exploitation of a minor, and child endangerment. The deal included 18 months in prison followed by 5 years of probation, plus financial restitution to be paid jointly with my father. The prosecutor was quoted, "This case has highlighted serious gaps in how we protect children's financial interests, particularly in blended families. The Thornton case has already inspired legislative review in 3 states." I closed the article, surprising myself with my own calm. The news felt less like a victory and more like the closing of a chapter, necessary but no longer defining my daily thoughts. My phone rang minutes later. Margaret, who had undoubtedly received the same alert. "Are you okay?" she asked, her concern evident even through the phone. "I'm fine," I replied, realizing it was true. "Actually better than fine. It feels finished somehow." "You don't have to be strong about this," Margaret reminded me gently. "It's okay if you have complicated feelings." "I know, but I think I've just moved on more than I realized." I glanced around at the library, at the students focused on their studies, at the life I was building. This is my reality now. After hanging up, I noticed an email notification from an unfamiliar address with the subject line, "Your story helped." Me. Curious, I opened it to find a message from a 16-year-old girl in Michigan who had seen my interview months earlier. "I never realized what was happening in my house was financial abuse until I heard you describe your experience. My stepfather has been taking money from a trust my grandmother set up for me. After I watched your interview, I talked to my school counselor, and now there's an investigation. I just wanted to say thank you for being brave enough to tell your story." It wasn't the first such message I'd received. Since the interview had aired, dozens of young people had reached out with similar stories of financial exploitation, of being isolated from extended family, of disparate treatment in blended households. Each time, I responded with encouragement and practical advice based on what I'd learned through my own legal journey. What had begun as my personal tragedy had sparked conversations about the vulnerabilities of children in financially abusive homes. A state senator who had championed the Thornton Act in Illinois, legislation strengthening oversight of children's trusts and inheritances, had contacted me about testifying at a committee hearing during winter break. My political science professor, Dr. Rivera, had encouraged me to document these developments, suggesting they could form the basis for an independent research project on the intersection of personal narrative and policy change. "Your experience has created a unique lens through which to view these issues," she had noted during office hours. "That perspective is valuable in academic discourse. The validation of my experience as something worth studying, worth understanding, in a broader context, had been unexpectedly healing. The shame that Lisa and my father had tried to instill, the narrative that I was overly sensitive, that I exaggerated problems, that I was never grateful enough, had been systematically dismantled, replaced by evidence that my perceptions had been accurate all along. That evening, I attended a meeting of the Student Advocacy Coalition, a campus group that connected law students with undergraduates interested in legal and social justice issues. I had joined hesitantly at first, uncertain whether I wanted to publicly align myself with my own story. But the group had welcomed me without prying, respecting my privacy while valuing my input. "We're discussing the campus legal aid project," explained Zoe, a second-year law student who had become something of a mentor. "There's a particular need for advocates who understand financial abuse cases." As the meeting progressed, I found myself speaking up more than usual, sharing insights about how financial control operates within families and the barriers that prevent young people from seeking help. "That's really insightful, Millie," said Professor Daniels, the group's faculty advisor. "Would you consider helping develop resources specifically addressing these issues? We could use someone with your perspective." The request caught me off guard. I had been a recipient of help, a survivor in need of support. The idea of stepping into a role where I could help others navigate similar situations represented a profound shift. "I'd like that," I said, surprising myself with my certainty. Walking back to my dormitory under a canopy of stars, I reflected on how far I'd come since that devastating day at O'Hare. The path hadn't been straightforward. There had been difficult days, moments of doubt, nights when the weight of everything that had happened threatened to overwhelm me. But with each step forward, each class completed, each new friendship formed, each opportunity to transform my experience into something that might help others, the defining narrative of my life was shifting. I was no longer simply the girl who had been abandoned, but a young woman finding purpose in the aftermath of betrayal. The snow fell in gentle swirls outside my dorm room window as I packed for winter break. My first semester at Princeton was ending, and unlike most of my peers who spoke of going home, I was heading to what still felt like a new beginning, Margaret's house in Boston, which she now insisted was our house. My phone chimed with a text from Will. "Good luck on your final exam tomorrow. Dad said I can visit you in Boston for a day during break, if that's okay with you and your aunt." The evolving relationship with my younger stepbrother had been one of the unexpected developments of the past few months. After giving his statement to investigators, Will had begun reaching out. Tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as he adjusted to life with his biological father. Our conversations had been awkward initially, weighted with the complicated history between us, but had gradually evolved into something resembling friendship. "That would be great," I replied. "Margaret already said she'd love to meet you." Sonny, in contrast, had maintained his distance. According to Will, he remained angry and confused, loyal to Lisa despite everything, and resentful of the upheaval in their lives. I understood his position, better than he probably realized. The need to defend a parent, to preserve some version of family mythology, was powerful. A knock at my door interrupted my packing. My roommate, Gabriella, poked her head in with her characteristic enthusiasm. "Study break," she announced, holding up a paper bag that smelled suspiciously of fresh cookies. "Brain fuel before tomorrow's exams." Gabriella had arrived as scheduled. During regular move-in week, a whirlwind of energy and warmth who had taken the brief explanation of my family difficulties in stride. She never pushed for details, but when the subject of my background occasionally arose, she listened without judgment. "You're the best," I said gratefully, accepting a warm chocolate chip cookie. I think my brain is officially full after that. Political science review session. "Speaking of which," Gabriella said, settling cross-legged on my bed, "Professor Rivera was looking for you after class. Something about that independent research proposal you submitted?" The proposal, a study of how personal narratives influence policy change using the Thornton Act and similar legislation as case studies, had been a shot in the dark, an ambitious project for a freshman. But Dr. Rivera had encouraged me to pursue it, suggesting it could potentially develop into a senior thesis with the right guidance. "I'll email her," I promised, making a mental note to do so before tomorrow's exam. As we chatted about final papers and winter break plans, I noticed an envelope that had slipped partially under my desk, official-looking, with the Princeton Financial Aid Office's return address. I retrieved it curiously. "Oh, that came yesterday while you were at the library," Gabriella explained. "Looked important." Opening it, I found a formal letter explaining that I had been selected for the Resilience Scholarship, a newly established fund for students who had overcome significant obstacles to attend Princeton. The award would provide additional support, beyond my existing scholarship covering expenses for books, travel, and professional attire. "What's that smile for?" Gabriella asked, noticing my expression. "Just some good news," I said, still processing the unexpected support. A reminder that sometimes things work out in ways you never expect. Later that night, after Gabriella had returned to her own last-minute studying, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past 7 months. The devastating moment at O'Hare seemed simultaneously like yesterday and like a lifetime ago. The acute pain had faded, replaced by a deeper understanding of both human cruelty and human kindness. My father, according to the updates Carl Donaldson occasionally provided, was complying with the terms of his probation, attending therapy, and working to pay back what had been taken from my trust. Lisa was serving her sentence at a minimum security facility in Illinois. Their house, my childhood home, had been sold to help satisfy the restitution requirements. These details no longer carried the emotional charge they once had. They were simply facts, parts of a story that had shaped but no longer defined me. My Laptop chimed with an incoming video call. Margaret, checking in before bed as had become our nightly ritual. "All packed for tomorrow?" she asked as her familiar face filled the screen. "Almost," I replied. "Just a few more things after my morning exam." "I got the guest room ready for Will's visit," she said. "And Elena called. She's planning to join us for dinner on Christmas Eve." Elena had been my mother's oldest friend, a connection Margaret had helped restore. Like many people from my early life, she had been deliberately cut out of the narrative by Lisa and my father. Her letters and calls intercepted, her existence nearly erased from my memory. The rebuilding of these relationships, the rediscovery of people who had known and loved my mother, who had tried to remain connected to me, had been one of the most healing aspects of the past months. "I was thinking," Margaret continued, "about Jennifer today. About how proud she would be of you, not just for Princeton, but for how you've handled everything." "I've been thinking about her too," I admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I understand her better now than I did when she was alive. The choices she made, the way she tried to protect my future, even when she knew she wouldn't be part of it." The silver book pendant still hung around my neck, a daily reminder of the legacy that had nearly been stolen, but had ultimately been preserved. "She always said you had her resilience," Margaret smiled. "More than you knew." After we said goodnight, I returned to my packing, carefully placing the framed photo of my mother that now sat on my desk into my weekend bag. As I did, I caught sight of my reflection in the window glass, no longer the abandoned girl at the airport, but a young woman finding her path forward. The wisdom that had emerged from the crucible of betrayal wasn't what I might have expected. It wasn't about hardening myself against future hurt or seeking revenge against those who had wronged me. Instead, it was about recognizing the strength that had always existed within me, about accepting help without shame, about transforming personal pain into purpose. Tomorrow, after my final exam, I would board a train to Boston, to the home Margaret and I were building together. Will would visit, bringing his own tentative steps toward healing. Elena would share more stories about my mother, filling in pieces of my history that had been deliberately obscured. And somewhere, perhaps, other young people would be finding their voices, recognizing the warning signs of exploitation and isolation, because of a story that had begun with abandonment, but had transformed into empowerment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.